Hello, my name is Kaisa Long, and this is my presentation on food and fashion in the Regency era. This was my topic that I chose to work on. Now, before I get any further, I do kind of want to talk about where I was towards the middle of the semester with my research projects, etc. Um, so, a little bit of a recap. Back kind of toward midterms, my questions were a lot more simple and open ended. And that's mostly because I was a little overwhelmed by how much there was about food and fashion on the internet. And so I chose to make my questions pretty broad. For example, my questions were like, what was food like? What was fashion like? How did this impact our understanding of Austen's literature and ourselves today? So, very open ended. Um, like I said, I had a lot of just general information. And so, fortunately, when I passed in my progress presentation, Dr. Stewart gave me some tips to maybe narrow it down to one novel and just kind of focus on the food and fashion in that novel. So I did. I chose Sense and Sensibility, and was able to narrow down my research a lot more. So now here are my questions, which are similar but different. I wanted to ask, what was fashion like specifically in Sense and Sensibility, and how did that impact the novel? What was the food like and food culture? How did that impact the novel? And I wanted to keep like my key question, my big question of how does this impact our understanding of Austen's literature and ourselves today. I wanted to not only just study the food and fashion, but also think about how it's relevant to us. I mean, maybe that's the teacher in me coming out and needing to make it relevant to my students, but I want to think about how it's relevant for us today in the year 2022. So I'm going to start and talk a little bit about fashion. Now, a little bit of an overview. I wanted to keep some facts that I learned in my research during my progress presentation and keep them in here because I do think they're important. And so, some historical significance to the fashion of the time would include Napoleon Bonaparte. He played a huge role in the fashion, and obviously the fashion of France, which translated to the fashion in England. And so, he controlled the textiles and thus the fashion, and kind of created this idea that women had to wear different dresses for different things, which we're going to talk about soon here. Men wore kind of more like military wear, etc. Now, for women specifically, we see the empire waist. We see a low neckline, emphasis kind of on the bust, lots of short sleeves. The idea was to have a high waist and have a dainty style. We see a lot of cotton as our textile of choice. Of course, you gotta mention the lacy caps and the bonnets and all the other little accessories depending on where and when, but that was just kind of the general overview of the whole fashion of the time. Now, again, we hear so much in pretty much every Jane Austen novel about muslin and the fabric that would go kind of along the neckline. It was kind of like a lacy kind of light fabric. I mean, the expectation was that it would be white, it would be clean, it would be expensive looking. There's a lot of Greek and Roman influence to the fashion, and we'll look at that in the pictures I have in a few slides here. And like I said, Napoleon wanted women to have all sorts of dresses for all sorts of occasions. And we see that. There was the day dress, there was the evening dress, there was the undress, half dress, full dress. And then there are all sorts of dresses in between, and they're all variations of the styles that I just talked about. But the important thing to kind of take away from this is that there's so many different gowns and dresses for women for so many different occasions. But they all kind of have somewhat similar influences and styles. Now, specifically in Sense and Sensibility, how the fashion kind of impacts the novel, what I found is that each character is described as dressing differently from each other, but how each character dresses describes their character. Also, socioeconomic status. For example, Eleanor and Marianne both dress kind of plainly, and that's supposed to give us, the reader, a hint about what their socioeconomic status is. Um, More specifically, Eleanor dresses attractively. She knows that she needs to fit in society and look good and be, who she needs to be to have a man and do her thing. And so she's very sensible with her fashion. Marianne, on the other hand, she's described in the book as being kind of indifferent toward her clothing. Again, dresses plainly as a representation of their socioeconomic status. Now, we'll talk about Marianne a little bit more in a second here. But then we see Edward, a man. I want to talk about men's fashion as well. He's not very impressed by fancy, fashionable dresses. He doesn't, try to go out of his way to dress himself very fancy. And again, we see that kind of sense in his personality and in his dressing, and thus, even with the way that Eleanor and Edward are dressed, we see them kind of being displayed as being perfect for each other because they even dress the same sensible way. Willoughby, of course, he dresses very fashionably, very sharp, very expensive, latest fashions, appearances really matter to him. And again, we see that kind of shallowness of his character demonstrated through the way he dresses. So, how people dress is very important to Austen in her novels, especially in Sense and Sensibility. Now, interestingly, the screen adaptations, what I've learned, don't always represent what Austen writes in the novel. For example, Marianne is dressed usually pretty colorfully, or like dressed to make her look younger than she is, or make her seem, I don't know, young and innocent and naive. Whereas Eleanor is not quite dressed the same way. It's best seen in the next slide here, where we see Eleanor and Marianne's mother here dressed very sensibly, like an older woman in society. Eleanor dressed like a typical young woman, very plain. We have the muslin on the sides here. And then Marianne dressed in bright yellow. Again, trying to make her look youthful, etc. Here we have, in the next picture, a screenshot from the movie adaptation that we watched in this class. Again, we see Eleanor. She's dressed very, very plainly, very sensibly. So is her man, Edward Ferrars. Another example of a typical dress. Now, here in these two pictures, you can really see the Greek and Roman influence, right? It's white, it's high-waisted, it's very flowy, kind of like the Grecian fashion, right? And in this last picture, you can see kind of different variations of shawls and accessories with the typical outfits. Now, I want to move on a little bit to food in the Regency era. Now, food is kind of similar to the fashion, but there are similarities and differences. Now, when you ate was dictated by many different things. Maybe if you were working class, you'd eat at a different time than the upper class people. There's a whole fashion to when you ate, which is a whole nother story. But what I want to focus on is specifically what they ate. So for breakfast, you'd eat it in the drawing room as a casual sort of thing. You would eat various baked goods if you could afford it. Tea obviously was and still is a hugely popular drink in England. Was back then too. Lunch you'd eat around 1 to 3 p.m. depending on your socioeconomic status or lifestyle. Sandwiches were new. They were all the fashion, but they weren't quite the sandwiches we know now. They were a little different. Dinner, of course, is the most important, most lavish meal. You'd eat it around 5 p.m. You'd have soup. If you were by the sea, you'd have fish. If you weren't by the sea, you'd have meat. Meat and vegetables were very important. They're also a sign of wealth because it would cost money to have meat, and then vegetables you could only get during certain months. And so oftentimes vegetables would be pickled, and you'd want to have enough, again, a sign of socioeconomic status, right? They thought veggies were bad for you. It's a fun fact. And they did have dessert. We saw marzipan. We saw different kinds of desserts, but that wasn't necessarily the main focus. Now, in Sense and Sensibility specifically, the novel begins with the Dashwoods in a financial crisis. They realize they don't have very much money and they need to figure out what to do about that. And because they don't have a lot of money, they realize that they need to kind of change their relationship with food. They can't have these lavish big meals anymore. They also can't have guests over because they can't afford to feed them, and that automatically influences who they are in society, right? Because the more people you could have over, the more wealth you could show off. Hopefully, the better matches you could have in the future. Now, interestingly, the source I read talked about how Mrs. Dashwood kind of has an emotional relationship with food. When the girls find out devastating information to them, they automatically don't want to eat, which is interesting, right? But then Mrs. Dashwood, their mom's way of figuring out how to deal with these emotional situations is to offer food, which they usually don't take. Food, from what I learned from this, is socioeconomic status. One goes with the other, right? Food directly demonstrates the socioeconomic status of a family and maybe also the emotional state. Now, here are some images to give you an idea of the food. I love this picture of all the different kinds of desserts and food, even the big salad here, to give you an idea of what the food looked like, how it was presented. We wanted big, lavish pieces and plates of food. Same thing with the fish over here. Like I said, people who lived by the sea would eat a lot of fish. Again, you get an idea of what it would look like, how it would be presented. We even have a picture from Sense and Sensibility of the family eating together, having a picnic, and also another picture of or a depiction of what it would be like to eat during this era. Everyone at the table, eating together. Now, my final findings and conclusions to my questions. First one, how does fashion impact the novel? Well, clearly, characters are dressed to represent who they are. Socioeconomic status, I guess, would have a little bit to do with that as well. But it's clear that Jane Austen really dresses her character and pays attention to their dress to give the reader small signals as to who these characters are. Similar with food, food is status. Hard stop. And so if a character goes to someone's house and they have a ton of food and it's very lavish, we know that this person is wealthy. Furthermore, we want our characters to be able to have these parties as well and to have them be lavish and so that they can be higher up in their socioeconomic status. Sometimes food tells us how a person is feeling. If they want to eat, then they're feeling pretty good. If not, then we know something's wrong. Overall, how does this impact our understanding of Austen and ourselves? Well, I do kind of want to, again, go back to how fashion is influenced by history. Napoleon Bonaparte's part in fashion, the Napoleonic Wars, influenced the fashion at the time. And it's important for us to think about that and think about maybe how our own current history or current events are impacting our fashion as well. Fashion demonstrates what a culture is like, what they value, etc. And we see this with all these different kinds of dresses, and clearly they valued really showing off who they were at the socioeconomic, or where they fall into the socioeconomic spectrum, etc. And lastly, food is an indicator of socioeconomic status and possibly emotional state as well. If you have lots of food, if you can afford to have people over all the time, have all these parties, then you have a higher socioeconomic status. Now, interestingly, I would argue that this is still true today. This is the point that Jane Austen wanted to make. That's also kind of true today. If I go over to a friend's house for a huge party and they have, really fancy desserts and tons of food that looks like it's catered, I'm going to assume that they spent a lot of money on this party. Whereas if you go over to a friend's house and it's a potluck, it's more low budget. And that tells us a lot about who the people are that we're friends with, right? Food is still super, super important. Now, I do have a link to my annotated bibliography at the end here, and that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.